Okay, it is now the top of the hour. I won't say what time it is because it depends where you are, but it is now the top of the hour and we're ready to start. I want to thank you all for joining us for this Sukkot class. And the way it's going to work is that I would ask you first to write any questions in the chat. When I'm done with my opening spiel, you can then, I will start to respond to your various questions. I see at least one person says they don't hear. I assume the rest of you do, or you'd also be writing you don't hear. So I know that I'm unmuted. Anyway, I'm going to start, and I hope you can hear me. And if you can't hear me, I hope you can read my lips. So Sukkot and home is the theme, and it brings me back actually to something that Elie Wiesel teaches, which is that the Torah begins with a bet. And one of the many interpretations of why that's so is bet stands for bayit. It stands for home, and the idea that the Torah actually represents a home and that you dwell in the Torah is something that I think our ancestors believed and were comfortable with, especially because, I don't know, by the way, I saw what someone wrote about closed captioning. I don't know if that's possible, but if Roy can do it, fine. If not, I'm sorry about that. I just don't know whether, in fact, closed captioning is possible. And I know that my laptop is a little echoey. That's because I don't have headphones for it. But I will get them for the next class. Anyway, look, the sukkah requires that you be in slightly uncomfortable conditions. That's actually part of Sukkot. So what can I tell you? In any case, it occurred to me when thinking about the reality that you can interpret the beginning of the Torah as home, that Judaism is to some extent a tradition of homelessness, because most of Jewish history has been spent outside of the Jewish home. First of all, we began outside of home with Abraham and Sarah, who are, remember, in Ur Kasdim and not in Israel. Then they're in Israel for a relatively brief time before, of course, we all end up in Egypt. And then all of the Torah is about wandering through the desert. And you don't actually enter the land in the Torah itself. You don't enter the land until the book of Joshua, which means that our foundational work is a work of homelessness. These days, the fashionable term is home insecurity, but this is not actually home insecurity. It is, in fact, homelessness. There is no home for the Israelites wandering in the desert. And there really is no home for the Israelites who are enslaved in Egypt as well. And then there is no home for the Israelites, practically speaking, once they leave Israel, once they're exiled, first in 586, and then again between the year 70 and then 135, which is the final exile until modern times. So it is unsurprising that issues of home and loss of home would be so important in the tradition, and longing for home would be so important in the Jewish tradition, since this dynamic of not being at home is so prevalent, and in fact is the dominant motif of the Torah, which we complete this weekend. That is the Torah. And therefore, part of the way the Jewish tradition can be seen is a longing for home. That's part of what is constituent of our tradition. And in this way, Sukkot is a really interesting not even double, sort of multiform kind of symbol. Let me just run through the ways in which Sukkot is home and isn't home, and represents not being home. First of all, the sukkah, as you know, to most people, most of the time, is an agricultural structure. That is, when you were out in the fields and you were harvesting and you couldn't come back because the fields were distant, so you slept in this makeshift hut. Now, in order to have agricultural fields that you live off of, you have to be home, right? The whole characteristic of an agricultural as opposed to a nomadic culture is living in one place. That is, I mean, depends who you ask, and I'm not going to get into the controversy, but that, according to many people, is the great revolution of human history, is that people that were nomadic became settled and stable once agriculture became widespread, the agricultural revolution. And the sukkah then represents stability and home because that's what agriculture represents. At the same time, of course, even in an agricultural milieu, the sukkah represents a home that's not a home. You're staying there because you're harvesting in the fields and you aren't home. So there is this duality even in the most home-like of Sukkot interpretations. But you may know that according to the rabbis, the sukkah also represents the sukkah, the covering of clouds in the desert. And I think part of the reason that the rabbis come up with this interpretation, which is not immediately obvious after all, that that's what the sukkah represents, is they want to figure out how Sukkot addresses the normative experiences of the Jewish people. And the normative experience was one of wandering and homelessness for most of our history. And throughout the Torah, how did they have Sukkot in the Torah? If you're in the desert, there's obviously no agriculture. There are no booths. Maybe they're the booths, the tents that you set up in the desert to live in, but a sukkah is not really a tent, right? It's a different kind of structure from a tent. Matovu ohalecha Yaakov, how beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, is not Matovu Sukkot, right? How beautiful are your sukkahs? Because a sukkah is a different kind of structure and probably doesn't serve very well in the desert, since the whole point of the sukkah is that the top is supposed to be open, and under a burning sky, that may not be the best choice. So how does a sukkah apply in the desert? The rabbis decided that the sukkah applied because of the sukkah of clouds, and that covered Israel. And so in that sense, the sukkah is the quintessence of homelessness, because you only need that kind of covering if you're wandering. If you're home, you don't need it by definition because you're home. So there is this constant play back and forth between the sukkah representing home and homelessness. And of course, in our own day and for many, many, many years now, dwelling in the sukkah was, I have to gesticulate more because I'm in one of those offices where the lights go off if you don't move around enough. And sitting here, all of a sudden, it started to get, the energy saving lamp started to dim. In our own day, of course, it reminds you that the sukkah is a symbol of the fragility of actual homes. In other words, the sukkah is supposed to represent the fact that our homes feel like they're very solid, but as we all know, the solidity of our homes is an illusion, and it lasts only as long as it lasts. And whether it's destroyed by a natural disaster or by the ravages of time or by human design, one way or another, our homes are going to get, our homes are going to disappear given enough time and enough erosion. And so the sukkah reminds us that the structures that human beings built are always temporary, and our home is always temporary. And that's one of the reasons why you're supposed to be able to see the stars, because that contrast between the temporariness of the human structure and the permanence of the divine, even though we happen to know that stars aren't permanent either, but they last a lot longer than we do. But nonetheless, at least the theoretical permanence of the divine is part of the contrast as well. Now, you may have heard of Robert Frost's definition of home, great definition. He said, home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. And I've thought about that's home, because in that sense, homes are sometimes created as opposed to found. The Israelites, when they came to Israel, did not have to be taken in. In fact, the native inhabitants greeted them in very mixed ways, if the accounts in Joshua and Judges are to be trusted. But they made it a place where it is now home. And it was on that theory, of course, that the modern state of Israel created the law of return. Because if you're going to have a homeland for Jews, you can't say to Jews, you're not a citizen of this homeland. The whole point is, however, and we don't need to get into the question of who is a Jew and who isn't, but whoever is a Jew, by whatever definition prevails at the time, in Israel's self-conception, obviously belongs there. And in that sense, the sukkah, again, is home and isn't home, because it's whenever you have to go there, they have to take you in. And the sukkah, of course, isn't there most of the time. So it can't take you in. The sukkah can't take you in the middle of February, because there's no sukkah. The other way, though, that the sukkah does represent home, just to continue this dialectic, is that it happens to be the one time during the year that we are explicitly invited to invite ancestors into the sukkah. And part of home is that there are generational ties to the place where you are. It's not so true, strangely, in the United States, but for most of human beings, for most of human history, your home was the place where your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, on and on and on, had lived. And inheriting that plot of land and that home was the sort of central human institution, which is why land inheritance in the Torah, in the Talmud, in most societies is so very crucial, because what you're inheriting, after all, is your home. It's often also your business, if it's pasture land or ranch land or something like that, but it's your home. And so the notion that we have that, I built the sukkah when I lived in this house, and I built the sukkah when I lived in that house, and I built the sukkah when I lived in the other house, that's a very modern mode of being in the world, with much less stability and continuity than any of our ancestors had or could have had before modern modes of travel. It's not like you could hop on an airplane in the 1500s. If you wanted to move somewhere else, it was a major and a dangerous undertaking, and you certainly didn't do it more than you had to. Maybe you did it once, maybe you did it twice, which gives us, of course, a renewed appreciation of the people, especially early on in the first couple of waves of migration who came to the United States, because again, they were coming to a place they had never seen, that they had no direct communication with except by letter, and letters, we know how unreliable they are, especially overseas, especially 150 years ago. But they made that move because they thought, one way or another, that it would be good for their lives and for the lives of their descendants. And so in that sense, too, the sukkah represents traditionally your one alternative home, as opposed to the multiple homes that we experience now. And you remember, of course, that part of the laws of the sukkah is that it is supposed to be fragile. It is not, however, and this is interesting, and I actually never thought about this until yesterday when I was sitting in the sukkah. I was sitting in the sukkah at the divinity school, and one of the divinity students, who's not Jewish, came to the outside of the sukkah and said, "Should I take my shoes off?" Because he thought it might be considered a holy place. And I said, that is a great question. Actually, no, you don't have to. It's outdoors. It's on grass. And he said, but is it outdoors or is it indoors? And I said, another great question. It's a liminal space. It's both outdoors and indoors, the sukkah. I mean, that's part of what makes it a sukkah, is you're not entirely indoors. Because remember, the roof has to be made of some organic matter that you can see through. So you're not entirely indoors. You're not entirely outdoors, but the floor is still dirt and grass, and you don't have to take your shoes off because it's not, in fact, a holy place, but it is a place where you do a mitzvah, one of two mitzvot that involve your entire body, the other one being the mikveh, right? You immerse yourself fully in a mikveh and you stand in the sukkah. But otherwise, you do mitzvot with part of you. Nonetheless, I thought it was a really fascinating question that was his assumption that it might be a holy place because it is a place that feels different from the rest of the surrounding space, and because it's a place where you do holy acts like make blessings, and because you invite in ancestors, ushpizin, who are part of this continuity of chain of holiness. So for all these reasons, I think that the sukkah has a very complex and interesting and multi impact sort of place in the issues of home and homelessness for the Jewish people. And the other thing, of course, to remember is that, again, traditionally, the only homes were homes. The institutionalization of people living in like old age home or senior living or resident hospitals for various kinds of illnesses or ailments, such a thing didn't exist. So the sukkah was really the only alternative home that most people ever experienced, because you couldn't put somebody in an institution of any kind that would be their home, since such institutions are really pretty recent on the human landscape. In fact, the first ones among them, I think, if I'm not mistaken, were universities. And that's the first places. Universities and monasteries were the only places you could be resident that were not home. Monasteries, we didn't do so much, as you might imagine, and universities. So in any case, those are some initial thoughts about home and homelessness. See if you can type your messages in. I hope that you can, or questions in, or comments in, and I am happy to respond to them. You will let me know. I assume you can, especially because somebody asked about closed captioning and something else. So I'm assuming that you can write your questions in or make your comments about Sukkot, which also, by the way, I'll just keep talking until some questions show up, which is also, after all, a holiday on which we build something. And actually building something is also unique in the Jewish calendar. There's no other time that we're enjoined to actually build something. I mean, you create a synagogue, but you don't have to build it, whereas everybody's supposed to build a sukkah, which makes me think that that's one of the reasons why it's called the time of our joy, because to actually build something and see the fruits of your own labor is, I believe, joyful. And if it's too hard to ask in print, then Roy, maybe it's just best to unmute anybody who raises their hand in one way or another. I don't know how you raise your hand. We're not on Zoom. We're on something else.
We are on Zoom. They can raise their hand or unmute themselves also to ask a question.
Oh, you can unmute yourself. Okay. Why is it said that if you build a sukkah, then you'll have to build one every year? Because once you do a mitzvah in Judaism, any mitzvah, you're not allowed to do less than that. It's a commitment. So the same thing is true with candles. You light 2 candles on Shabbat. You're allowed to add a candle, but once you add a candle, you're not allowed to take it away again, because you can ma'alim b'kodesh. You can go up in holiness, but lo moridim b'kodesh, but you can't go down in holiness. So you're committed once you've done it. You got to keep doing it. That's the idea. It's like we roped you in. It's like that story, that's great story in the Talmud about Rabbi Yochanan is arguing that we should blow the shofar, even though the temple was destroyed. We should still blow the shofar for the new moon, and the I'll get to King David and the sukkah. That's a great question in a second. But we should still blow the shofar for the new moon, even though the temple was destroyed. And the other rabbis are arguing, no, we shouldn't, because the temple was destroyed. We don't blow the shofar. And Rabbi Yochanan says, well, it's really a question, and the new moon is coming, so let's blow it and then we'll talk about it. But now is the time, so let's do it. We'll blow it and then we'll discuss it. So he blows it, and then they say, okay, let's discuss it. He says, there's no reason to discuss it. Now we have a precedent. So now we blow it. And it's the same thing here. Once you do it, you have to keep doing it. So we talk about Sukkah David HaNafalet in the Birkat Hamazon, for example, the fallen sukkah of David. There, I think it's really metaphorical. There's no evidence that David actually had a sukkah, or that there was a sukkah until much later, but it's, I think, supposed to represent the Davidic kingdom and the eternal, sovereignty of David. And the sukkah there might even be a metaphor for the temple. Although David didn't build the temple, obviously Solomon does. David's not allowed to, but it's a messianic hope, like David's rule and David's sovereignty. But if you read the story of David, there's no mention of Sukkah or Sukkot, probably because they didn't. Although since the idea is mentioned in Torah, it's not impossible. But I don't think we have any evidence of it before the rabbinic period. It would be it's worth checking whether there's any evidence before. I can find out very easily once my colleague John Levinson is down the hall. I'll ask him; he'll know. What else? Why can't we keep it up all the time? Because that takes away the whole point of it. The whole point of the sukkah is that it's temporary, and it's supposed to be able to be knocked down by like a strong wind or whatever. And by the way, in most of the places that Jews lived, you couldn't keep it up all year long for exactly that reason, but also because it's supposed to remind you of the temporariness of structures. Therefore, if your sukkah is too strong and too reinforced, it's not kosher. So it has to be temporary in both senses. That is fragile and to be taken down. And no, I don't have a favorite Sukkot joke, although, well, I only have one Sukkot joke. I suppose that makes it the favorite, which is people claim that it happened. I don't know whether it happened or not, but about the guy whose neighbor was anti-Semitic and hated the fact that he put up a sukkah and took him to court. And the judge, who happened to be Jewish, said, "You're absolutely right. It is an intrusion on the neighborhood. I give you 1 week to take it down." So that's the only Sukkot joke I know. The lulav and the etrog obviously have their roots in Sukkot being an agricultural holiday. I mean, there are lots of metaphorical and Kabbalistic um, significances given to both the various limbs of human beings, the smell of the etrog being, a foretaste of the smell of paradise, the idea that all Jews are like one of the different kinds of species of the lulav, all those kinds of things. But really, it's clearly a leftover from bringing in the sheaves and the idea that the fruit harvest and the other harvests of the time are like represented by the lulav and the gratitude to God, because one of the things that we're somewhat detached from is our reliance on rain and the agricultural cycle of the seasons, because you can go into Whole Foods, and get, I don't know, rutabagas all year long or whatever it is. But obviously for our ancestors, that was not true. And for most of human history, if the rains didn't come, or it's still true in many places, including here, that too much rain is a disaster and too little rain is a disaster. And the crops, you have to thank God for rain in its time and the crops. And it seems to me pretty clear, as a lot of scholars have said, that the lulav and the etrog are remnants of an earlier pagan celebration that is a celebration of nature, since what pagans worship were the forces of nature. Some sukkot are very simple, some more elaborate. What's the most elaborate or expensive sukkah you've ever seen? Boy, what is the most elaborate or expensive sukkah I've ever seen? I don't know. I have to think about that. I don't know that I've seen big sukkahs. I don't know that I've seen elaborate or expensive ones particularly. I don't know if I know a sukkah bigger than the one that we have on Wilshire Patio at Sinai. I probably have, but I don't remember them. You can't make them too big or they won't be kosher, because then they have to be too sturdy. The relationship of a chuppah to the Sukkot is covering. A chuppah, a talis, a sukkah, all of those things suggest covering and protection. Even a kippah. The reason you wear a talit in the morning and not in the evening, according to many commentators, is because in the evening you say the Hashkivenu prayer, the evening prayer for peace, where you say Pares Sukkot Shalom, spread your sukkah of peace on us and on all Israel. And since you spread the sukkah of peace in the prayer, you don't need the additional protection of the talis. And that gives you this sense that all these things in common, the talis, the chuppah, the sukkah, they're all about some kind of protection and covering and safety in a dangerous world. What else? Let's see. Other mentions of it are unrelated to the holiday. Well, yeah, Sukkot Shalom. And let's see, Elvis Presley was fascinated. When he got back, he told Tom Parker how wonderful his trip had been. He got back and wrote, "I'm all shook up." I don't think so, but it's a good story. Presley was, as you know, when he was young, a Shabbos boy. I don't know if you know that. Like, he used to turn the lights on and off for a local Jewish family that asked him to do that. So he had some familiarity with Jews. Also true, by the way, of Colin Powell, which was how he learned Yiddish. And he speaks Yiddish. Very interesting how these sorts of things intersect. Let's see. One day after Sukkot, I guess these are the favorite Sukkah jokes that I didn't know. The Cohn family were very conscientious and were all about recycling. They had special bins for paper glass. One day after Sukkot, the children got all excited. The parents gave them a gift. They fall off the wrapping, and soon their new toy was revealed, Mr. Etrog Head. Not sure that one would qualify as my favorite Sukkah joke, but all right. Given the paucity of supply, we'll take it. That also, as you may know, like the search for the perfect etrog is so endemic in the Jewish tradition that there are stories about it, about people neglecting their families or so on, because all they want to find is the perfect etrog, and they'll spend any amount of money on it and so on. And like Hasidic and a story by Agnon about finding this perfect etrog, and then of course it drops and the stem breaks and it's not kosher, and it's all about the conflict between, you know, the inner meaning of the place and of the holiday, and trying to find ritual objects and the ritual meaning of it. So, which is always in any tradition, but especially a tradition that is action oriented, there's going to be a conflict there. Yes, the movie Ushpizin is a classic, beautiful, and the Ushpizin are only on Sukkot. And I think that the reason that that's so is because you have a sort of temporary home for them to come and visit. And they don't have to stay because the sukkah doesn't stay. The only other time that I'm aware of that we have an actual ritual of inviting someone into your home is Elijah, which you do obviously on Passover. You open the door to Elijah, but also on a Brit Milah, you invite Elijah in. And of course, you know, we ask for Elijah at the end of Shabbat and Yom Kippur. So at the end of Havdalah, you ask for Elijah. But other than that, I think Ushpizin are only about Sukkot. And my guess is that the logic of that was that, in fact, you had this special home that was entirely devoted to tradition. You don't have a sukkah without the tradition. And so you want the ancestors of Israel to come and go through your sukkah and see that you're keeping the tradition that they began hundreds and sometimes thousands of years ago. So it's quite a beautiful idea, the idea of inviting in Ushpizin to join you in the sukkah. I like it very much. And yes, we should all watch Ushpizin every Sukkot. I haven't seen it in years, but I have to fire up the Netflix and see if it's still on. Let's see, what else do we have? I can't quite read that. I see that there's something from Home Depot about, I assume it's about Sukkot, but I can't see what it is since Bernie Marcus is Jewish. Let me see if I can. On the upcoming Sukkot season, we apologize. We're out of stock of the thing that holds the thing that connects the thing to the thing. Sorry, that's very funny. By the way, as you may or may not know, that the owner of Home Depot, Bernie Marcus, is a major contributor to Jewish causes and is a mainstay of the Jewish community of Atlanta. I'm not aware of any rituals associated with the Ushpizin other than there is in some prayer books a formula that you say to invite them in. But apart from that, I don't know of any ritual that, although it would be easy to create, you could easily go around the table and ask people, what would you say if this ancestor were here, or that ancestor? Some of you know the New York Times Book Review always has what three people they asked in the interview. What three people would you invite to dinner if you could invite anyone? You know, it's always three authors that people pick, but that's kind of a fun parlor game. So what three figures from Jewish history would you invite to have conversation around the table? I don't know. I'd have to give that some thought, assuming they could all communicate with each other, of course, right? Which would be its own challenge. But assuming they could, who would you invite? What three people? Other questions, comments, Sukkot observations? I would say that the other The other thing that is true about Sukkot that is nominally true about Shabbat and about Pesach, but especially about Sukkot, is that the idea of inviting someone to your sukkah. I mean, we have the idea, obviously, of inviting people to the Seder. Everybody, all who are poor, empty, come and eat, all who are hungry, come and eat. But the idea of inviting someone to the sukkah is sort of inherent in the holiday, right? You create this structure and then you have people into the structure. And so there is a communal aspect to the holiday, and that may be, in fact, where the Ushpizin idea came, which is if you're inviting your neighbor, you may as well invite your not immediately proximate neighbor, but your far away neighbor in time, as well as your neighbors who live next door. And the decorating of the sukkah, again, is I don't know how Sukkot were decorated in the Middle Ages. I'm sure they put fruit up and things like that, but the idea of like stringing all the cards and all the names and so on, those are all fairly modern additions, I think, to the sukkah canon, so to speak. And they're nice ones. They're nice ones. Why don't more Americans celebrate this holiday? Well, more of them celebrate it than Shavuot, I would guess. So the degree to which most non-traditional Jews celebrate holidays has less to do with the importance of the holiday than it has to do with the ease and public symbol of it. So it's very easy to celebrate Hanukkah. You get a Chanukiah and you light candles. Pesach, to celebrate properly, is a lot of work. But if you're just making a Seder, it doesn't have to be a lot of work. And besides, it's kind of fun. But to build a sukkah, that's a fairly considerable undertaking. And I think most Passover and Hanukkah basically take the prize. The only holiday that's celebrated really because of its importance is Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah, maybe not even because of its importance, but because we have a new year. But the others, Sukkot and Shavuot, no, I mean Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah, not so celebrated comparatively, even though Simchas Torah, again, has a lot going for it. But that would be my immediate reaction, is that it's not a function of the importance of the holiday. If it was a function of the importance of the holiday, Jews would celebrate is the wrong word. Jews would observe Tisha B'Av, which is the day of mourning in the Jewish calendar, and is a very important day for traditional Jews, but is almost completely neglected among the non-traditional community. But traditional Jews fast. It is the other major fast of the year. There are many fasts in the Jewish calendar. The other major fast, apart from Yom Kippur, is Tisha B'Av, and it's a much sadder fast too. It commemorates the destruction of the first temple, the second temple, various tragedies that happened in the Middle Ages, and most Jews just are both unaware and unobservant of the holiday. So what can I tell you? You're welcome to Sinai, though. We will be observing Tisha B'Av come the summer. It's also in the summer months when people are on vacation. Which is another actually really critical factor, is until modern times, the calendar of a Jew's life was the Jewish calendar. But the calendar of our lives is the Western/American calendar, right? The school year, summer vacations, winter vacations. I mean, Hanukkah wasn't winter vacation in Eastern Europe, it was just Hanukkah. But since we live in obviously a dominant culture that has a certain calendar, So we live by that calendar because we live in that culture. What can I tell you? I don't know what that beeping is, but I'm sure it will go away. I don't know if you can hear it, but I can. Anyway, are there any other questions about Sukkot or about anything else before we fold up our tent or collapse our sukkah? Watching from my sukkah on this glorious New York City autumn day. Thank you. And thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's actually very nice here on the East these days, those of you who are in Los Angeles, so you don't get to laugh at me yet. Not yet. Soon, but not yet. But I will be back in Los Angeles for the installation of my successors on the weekend of October 20th, 21st. Once again, by the way, I don't know if you can tell, the light went off in my, but it looks like you can still see me, so I'm not going to bother with it. And so for those of you that will attend, I hope to see you there, and it will be a wonderful celebration of their ascent to senioritis or seniorhood or whatever it's called. I don't know. There you go. There's the installation lunch. Sinai Temple, 10/21/2023. Roy is good. He is really good. And thank you, Roy. And thank you also to you and to Amanda for setting this up. And I really hope I do see you there at the installation lunch, because it's a wonderful and a joyous thing. And I look forward to being back in LA to see it. So with that, I will thank you all and say Chag Sameach or Moadim L'Simcha, whatever you choose, and hope to see you again soon. Bye.